Sarah Chen had always been the invisible girl. At 22, she possessed an almost supernatural ability to blend into the background of any room she entered. Her small frame, standing barely 5 feet 2 inches tall, seemed to shrink even further when surrounded by others. She spoke in whispers when she spoke at all, and her dark eyes held secrets that nobody bothered to uncover. Growing up in a military family had taught Sarah many things, but fitting in wasn't one of them. Her father, Colonel James Chen, had spent most of her childhood deployed overseas, leaving Sarah and her mother to navigate the constant relocations from one military base to another. Each new school brought the same challenges, new faces, new social dynamics, and the same old pattern of being overlooked. The other kids never understood why Sarah preferred books to parties, why she chose the library over the cafeteria, why she walked alone down hallways filled with laughter and conversation that never included her. They saw her silence as weakness, her preference for solitude as social inadequacy. What they didn't see were the hours Sarah spent in her father's study when he was home, learning about strategy, discipline, and the ancient art of self-defense. Colonel Chen believed that strength came in many forms. While other fathers taught their daughters to be pretty and popular, he taught Sarah to be prepared. The loudest person in the room is rarely the most dangerous, he would tell her during their weekend training sessions in the garage. True power doesn't need to announce itself. Sarah absorbed these lessons like a sponge, but she kept them hidden beneath layers of shyness and social anxiety. At school, she endured the daily humiliations with silent resignation. When Jennifer Morrison and her crew would knock her books to the floor, Sarah would quietly pick them up. When they called her mute girl or ghost face, she would simply look away and continue walking. The mockery followed a predictable pattern. During lunch, Sarah would find an empty table in the corner of the cafeteria, usually near the windows where she could watch the world outside while eating her sandwich in peace. But peace was a luxury rarely afforded to those who couldn't defend themselves socially. "Look, it's the statue," Jennifer would announce loudly enough for half the cafeteria to hear. "Does it even know how to talk, or did someone forget to install a voice box?" The laughter that followed these comments always made Sarah's cheeks burn with embarrassment, but she never responded. Her father's voice would echo in her mind, "Choose your battles wisely, Sarah. Not every provocation deserves a response." Teachers often overlooked Sarah's academic excellence because she never volunteered answers or participated in class discussions. Her grades were exemplary, but her presence was forgettable. During parent-teacher conferences, educators would struggle to provide meaningful feedback about a student who had somehow managed to be both present and absent simultaneously. Sarah's mother, Linda, worried constantly about her daughter's social development. "She needs friends," Linda would tell her husband during their rare phone conversations. "She needs to learn how to connect with people her own age." But Colonel Chen saw something different in his daughter. During his brief visits home, he noticed the way Sarah moved with unconscious grace, how she observed everything while appearing to notice nothing, how she processed information with analytical precision that reminded him of his best intelligence officers. "She's not broken, Linda," he would reassure his wife. "She's just different. Some people are built for noise and chaos. Others are built for precision and purpose." Sarah's high school years passed in a blur of academic achievement and social invisibility. She graduated valedictorian of her class, but nobody remembered her speech because she had declined to give one. Instead, she had quietly arranged for the salutatorian to speak in her place, preferring to remain in the shadows even during her moment of triumph. College brought new hopes for reinvention, but old patterns died hard. At the University of California, Sarah found herself once again relegated to the margins of campus life. Her dorm mates were friendly enough, but their attempts at inclusion felt forced and temporary. They would invite her to parties out of politeness, then forget she existed when she politely declined. Sarah's major in international relations and psychology seemed fitting for someone who spent so much time observing human behavior from the outside. She excelled in her coursework, particularly in classes focused on conflict resolution and cultural dynamics. Professors appreciated her thoughtful written analyses, even if they wished she would contribute more to class discussions. The university's martial arts club had caught Sarah's attention during the activities fair, but she had walked past their booth 3 times before finally working up the courage to sign up. Even then, she had done it anonymously, slipping her contact information into their sign-up box when no one was looking. Master Lu, the club's instructor, recognized something familiar in Sarah's tentative approach to training. He had seen many students over the years, some loud and aggressive, others quiet and focused. Sarah fell into a category entirely her own, silent but absorptive, gentle but determined. Martial arts is not about defeating others, Master Lu would tell his students. It is about understanding yourself and your capabilities. The greatest warriors in history were often the most peaceful, because they knew the true cost of conflict. Sarah took these lessons to heart, training with a dedication that impressed her instructor and puzzled her classmates. While others approached martial arts as a workout or a way to build confidence, Sarah seemed to view it as essential preparation for something undefined but inevitable. Her progress was remarkable but quiet. Sarah never sparred aggressively or showed off her developing skills. Instead, she absorbed techniques like a scholar studying ancient texts, treating each movement as a piece of knowledge to be catalogued and perfected. The other club members initially tried to include Sarah in their post-training social gatherings, but her polite rejections eventually led to a comfortable distance. They respected her dedication to training while accepting that she preferred to keep her martial arts practice separate from her social life. Sarah's college years established a pattern that would follow her into adulthood: excellence without recognition, competence without confidence, strength without swagger. She graduated magna cum laude with a degree in international relations, minors in psychology and Asian studies, and a black belt in 3 different martial arts disciplines that nobody at her graduation ceremony would have guessed she possessed. Her job search led her to a position with the Department of Defense as a cultural liaison specialist. The work involved briefing military personnel on cultural sensitivities and communication strategies for international deployments. It was perfect for someone who understood the importance of observation, preparation, and respect for different perspectives. Sarah's colleagues at the DoD appreciated her thorough briefings and detailed reports, but she remained as socially invisible in her professional life as she had been in school. She attended required meetings, contributed when asked direct questions, and completed her assignments with impressive efficiency, but she never lingered for office small talk or joined colleagues for after-work drinks. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that she spent her days teaching others about communication and cultural understanding while remaining largely unable to connect with her own peers. But she found satisfaction in her work, knowing that her briefings helped prevent misunderstandings that could escalate into dangerous situations overseas. Her apartment reflected her personality: neat, functional, and quietly sophisticated. Books lined the walls, covering topics from ancient philosophy to modern conflict resolution. A small section of the living room had been converted into a practice space where Sarah continued her martial arts training in private, maintaining the skills her father had taught her to develop and that Master Lu had helped her refine. Sarah's life had settled into a comfortable routine of professional competence and personal solitude when the invitation arrived that would change everything. The envelope bore the seal of Camp Pendleton, and the letter inside was signed by Major General Patricia Williams, requesting Sarah's participation in a special cultural sensitivity training program for elite Marine units. The program would involve spending a week at Camp Pendleton, working with small groups of Marines who were preparing for deployment to culturally sensitive regions. Sarah's expertise in international relations and her security clearance made her an ideal candidate for the assignment. As Sarah read the letter, she felt the familiar mixture of excitement and anxiety that accompanied any new challenge. She had briefed military personnel before, but always in the controlled environment of conference rooms and lecture halls. This assignment would place her directly among some of the military's most elite and potentially intimidating personnel. The night before her departure for Camp Pendleton, Sarah practiced her presentation in front of her bedroom mirror, rehearsing the key points she wanted to convey about cultural respect and communication strategies. She packed her professional attire, her presentation materials, and, almost as an afterthought, a change of clothes suitable for physical training. Sarah had no way of knowing that this routine assignment would become the crucible where her lifetime of quiet observation and hidden preparation would finally find their purpose. She couldn't predict that the skills her father had insisted she develop, the techniques Master Lu had taught her to perfect, and the inner strength she had cultivated through years of social isolation would all converge in a moment that would force the world to see her differently. The quiet girl who had spent her life being overlooked was about to discover that sometimes the most powerful statements are made not with words, but with actions that speak louder than any voice ever could. Hashtag the challenge. The morning sun cast long shadows across Camp Pendleton as Sarah Chen walked through the main gate, her visitor's badge clipped neatly to her blazer. The base buzzed with activity that both intimidated and fascinated her. Marines jogged past in perfect formation, their synchronized footsteps creating a rhythmic percussion that echoed off the surrounding buildings. Vehicles moved with military precision, and everywhere Sarah looked, she saw examples of the discipline and order that her father had always spoken about with such reverence. Major General Williams met Sarah at the administrative building, and their initial conversation revealed both the scope and the challenge of her assignment. The Marines she would be working with were part of an elite reconnaissance unit preparing for deployment to Southeast Asia, where cultural misunderstandings had previously led to diplomatic incidents that threatened operational success. "These men are the best at what they do," General Williams explained as they walked toward the training facility. "They're tough, they're smart, and they're absolutely dedicated to their mission. But they're also young, confident, and sometimes that confidence can manifest as arrogance when dealing with civilian populations." Sarah nodded, making mental notes about the delicate balance she would need to strike between respecting their expertise while challenging their assumptions about cultural engagement. "I should warn you," General Williams continued, "this particular unit has a reputation for being skeptical of civilian consultants. They've been through cultural training before, and they tend to view it as a box to check rather than a skill to develop." The training facility was a large open space with classroom areas on one end and physical training areas on the other. As Sarah entered, she could hear the sound of intense physical exercise coming from the PT section, accompanied by the sharp commands of drill instructors and the responding shouts of Marines pushing themselves to their limits. Her assigned classroom was smaller than she had expected, designed for intimate group discussions rather than large lectures. Sarah spent the morning setting up her materials and reviewing her presentation notes, trying to anticipate the questions and challenges she might face from an audience known for their skepticism of outsiders. The 8 Marines who filed into her classroom just after lunch were exactly what Sarah had expected, yet somehow more intimidating than she had prepared for. Each man was a specimen of physical fitness and mental sharpness, their bearing reflecting years of elite training and operational experience. They moved with the confident swagger of individuals who had proven themselves in the most challenging circumstances imaginable. Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez was clearly the group's informal leader, a compact but powerfully built man whose presence commanded attention even when he wasn't speaking. Corporal James Tank Washington earned his nickname honestly, standing 6 feet 4 inches and carrying nearly 250 pounds of muscle with surprising grace. Sergeant Alex Mitchell possessed the lean build of a distance runner but carried himself with the alertness of someone constantly ready for action. The others were equally impressive. Corporal Danny Kim, whose quick wit and sharp intelligence made him the unit's communications specialist, Lance Corporal Marcus Thompson, whose calm demeanor masked an analytical mind that excelled at tactical planning, Private First Class Tyler Brooks, the youngest member of the group but already showing the leadership potential that had earned him his place among these elite operators, Sergeant Chris Parker, whose technical expertise with weapons and equipment was legendary throughout the unit, and Corporal Sam Foster, whose language skills and cultural knowledge made him invaluable for overseas operations. Sarah introduced herself with the same quiet professionalism she had developed over years of similar briefings, but she could immediately sense the group's collective skepticism. Their body language spoke volumes, arms crossed, leaning back in chairs, exchanging glances that suggested they were already planning what they would do with the time they considered wasted. "Good afternoon," Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly through the room despite its soft tone. "I'm Sarah Chen, and I'll be working with you this week on cultural engagement strategies for your upcoming deployment." Staff Sergeant Rodriguez raised his hand with mock formality. "Ma'am, with all due respect, we've been through cultural training before. We know not to disrespect local customs and to work with interpreters. Is there something specific you're going to teach us that we haven't already covered?" Sarah had encountered this attitude before, though rarely so directly expressed. She recognized the challenge inherent in Rodriguez's question. He wasn't just asking for information, he was testing whether she understood the reality of their work and whether she had anything valuable to contribute. "That's a fair question, Staff Sergeant," Sarah replied calmly. You're right that you've covered the basics of cultural respect and interpreter protocols. What I'd like to focus on are the subtle communication dynamics that can make the difference between successful community engagement and unintentional escalation. Corporal Washington shifted in his seat, his massive frame somehow managing to convey skepticism through posture alone. Ma'am, no offense, but have you ever been deployed? Have you ever had to deal with hostile populations or navigate situations where cultural misunderstanding could get people killed? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah could feel all 8 Marines watching her response, evaluating not just her answer but how she handled the pressure of their collective scrutiny. This was clearly a test, and how she responded would determine whether they would give her their attention or simply endure her presence. No, Corporal Washington, I haven't been deployed in a combat role, Sarah answered honestly. But I have spent considerable time studying the after-action reports from cultural incidents that escalated unnecessarily, and I've interviewed dozens of Marines who have dealt with the consequences of those escalations. She moved to the whiteboard and began sketching a simple diagram. What I've learned is that most cultural conflicts don't start with major misunderstandings. They begin with small assumptions, subtle nonverbal cues, and communication patterns that gradually build tension until someone feels disrespected or threatened. Sergeant Mitchell leaned forward slightly, showing the first sign of genuine interest from the group. Can you give us a specific example? Sarah described an incident from Afghanistan where a Marine unit's attempt to establish community relations had failed because they had unknowingly violated local protocols about eye contact with women, leading to a breakdown in trust that took months to rebuild. She explained how understanding these nuances could have prevented the entire escalation. That's interesting, Corporal Kim admitted, but how do we balance cultural sensitivity with operational security? Sometimes we can't afford to spend time worrying about whether we're following every local custom. The question opened the door to a more substantive discussion, and, for the next hour, Sarah found herself engaged in a genuine dialogue with the Marines about the practical challenges of cultural engagement in operational environments. Their questions were intelligent and, based on real-world experience, and Sarah found herself drawing on every aspect of her training to provide useful, actionable insights. As the afternoon progressed, the Marines' initial skepticism began to give way to grudging respect for Sarah's knowledge and preparation. She demonstrated an understanding of military operations that surprised them, and her cultural insights were clearly based on extensive research rather than academic theory alone. However, their fundamental assessment of Sarah herself remained unchanged. They saw her as a competent civilian consultant who understood her subject matter, but they still viewed her through the lens of their own cultural assumptions about quiet, bookish women who worked behind desks rather than in operational environments. During a break, Sarah overheard fragments of their conversation that revealed their true opinions. She knows her stuff, Rodriguez acknowledged to Washington, but she's exactly what you'd expect from a DoD cultural specialist. Probably never thrown a punch in her life. Nothing wrong with that, Washington replied diplomatically, but it's hard to take advice about handling tough situations from someone who probably gets nervous ordering coffee. Sarah pretended not to hear these comments, but they stung because they reflected the same assumptions she had faced her entire life. Even when people recognized her competence, they still saw her as fundamentally weak, unsuited for anything requiring physical courage or the ability to handle confrontational situations. The next 2 days followed a similar pattern. Sarah delivered excellent training sessions that provided genuine value to the Marines, and they responded with professional attention and thoughtful questions. But, underneath their courteous behavior, she could sense their persistent belief that she was essentially a fragile civilian who needed protection from the real world they inhabited. This perception was reinforced by Sarah's behavior outside the classroom. During meals in the mess hall, she sat alone unless invited to join conversations, and, even then, she contributed minimally to discussions about training exercises, deployment experiences, or military culture. When the Marines engaged in physical training or combat exercises, Sarah observed from a distance, clearly out of place in an environment defined by physical prowess and aggressive competition. The Marines weren't intentionally cruel, but they also weren't particularly careful about hiding their assessment of Sarah's limitations. They would make casual comments about civilian consultants and desk jockeys that weren't specifically directed at Sarah but clearly included her in their scope. They would reference experiences and challenges that they assumed she couldn't understand, and they would discuss training exercises and physical challenges in ways that unconsciously excluded her from their world. By the fourth day of the training program, a clear dynamic had been established. The Marines respected Sarah's professional expertise and appreciated the value of her cultural training, but they had categorized her as a competent but essentially weak civilian who belonged in conference rooms and lecture halls rather than in situations requiring physical courage or the ability to handle real-world pressure. This assessment seemed confirmed by Sarah's consistent pattern of avoiding any situation that might require physical confrontation or aggressive behavior. When the Marines engaged in competitive exercises or friendly challenges among themselves, Sarah remained on the sidelines. When conversations turned to topics involving physical prowess or combat experience, she contributed nothing. When opportunities arose for her to demonstrate any kind of physical capability, she consistently declined or deflected. The morning of the fifth day brought an unexpected change in the training schedule. General Williams informed Sarah that the Marines would be conducting a close-quarters combat exercise that afternoon, and she was welcome to observe if she was interested in seeing how cultural considerations might apply in high-pressure tactical situations. Sarah accepted the invitation, though she could see in the Marines' expressions that they viewed her attendance as purely observational. None of them expected her to participate or contribute anything meaningful to an exercise focused on physical skills and tactical decision-making under pressure. The close-quarters combat training took place in a specially designed facility that simulated urban combat environments. The exercise would test the Marines' ability to clear rooms, neutralize threats, and make split-second tactical decisions while operating as a coordinated unit. As Sarah watched the Marines prepare for their exercise, checking equipment and reviewing tactical procedures, she had no idea that she was about to face a situation that would force her to reveal capabilities she had kept hidden for more than 2 decades. The quiet cultural consultant who had spent her life avoiding confrontation was about to discover that sometimes circumstances demand that even the most peaceful individuals demonstrate their true strength. #The moment of truth. The close-quarters combat facility hummed with nervous energy as the 8 Marines completed their equipment checks and reviewed their tactical procedures one final time. Sarah stood off to the side, clipboard in hand, ostensibly there to observe how cultural considerations might factor into high-pressure tactical situations. In reality, she found herself fascinated by the transformation she witnessed as these men shifted from classroom students into combat operators. The exercise scenario involved clearing a multi-room facility where hostile combatants were holding civilian hostages. The Marines would need to move through the structure systematically, neutralizing threats while avoiding civilian casualties and maintaining unit cohesion under intense pressure. It was exactly the type of high-stakes situation where cultural awareness could mean the difference between mission success and tragic escalation. Master Sergeant Kelly, the exercise instructor, briefed the unit on their objectives while Sarah listened from her position near the observation area. The scenario had been designed to test not just their combat skills but their decision-making abilities under stress, particularly their capacity to distinguish between legitimate threats and non-combatants who might be behaving unpredictably due to fear or cultural differences. Remember, Master Sergeant Kelly emphasized, in real-world operations, you'll encounter civilians who may not respond to your commands in ways you expect. Language barriers, cultural differences, and sheer terror can cause people to behave in ways that might seem threatening but are actually just expressions of fear or confusion. Sarah appreciated the instructor's emphasis on these considerations, as they directly related to the training she had been providing all week. She made notes about how she might incorporate similar scenarios into future cultural awareness sessions, thinking about ways to help Marines understand the perspective of civilians caught in chaotic situations. The exercise began with the Marines moving into position outside the facility. Sarah watched through the observation windows as they communicated through hand signals and prepared to make their entry. Their transformation from the somewhat skeptical students she had worked with all week into focused, professional operators was remarkable to witness. The first phase of the exercise proceeded smoothly. The Marines moved through the initial rooms with textbook precision, their movements coordinated and their communication clear and efficient. They encountered several role players representing both hostile combatants and civilian non-combatants, and their responses demonstrated excellent tactical judgment and cultural sensitivity. Sarah found herself genuinely impressed by their performance. The same Marines who had questioned the value of cultural training were now demonstrating sophisticated understanding of how to interact with simulated civilians while maintaining tactical security. They were patient with confused role-players, clear in their commands, and careful to avoid actions that might be perceived as unnecessarily aggressive or culturally insensitive. The exercise was progressing exactly as planned until an unexpected equipment malfunction changed everything. Master Sergeant Kelly was monitoring the exercise from the control room when a power surge caused a critical failure in the facility's electronic systems. The lights went out, the communication systems failed, and, most seriously, the electronic locks on several doors malfunctioned, sealing the Marines inside different sections of the facility while simultaneously releasing several role-players who were supposed to remain in designated areas. In the confusion that followed the power failure, one of the role-players became genuinely disoriented and panicked. Instead of following his assigned script, he began moving erratically through the darkened facility, calling out in distress and inadvertently creating a dangerous situation for himself and the Marines who were trying to complete their exercise while dealing with unexpected circumstances. Sarah watched from the observation area as emergency lighting flickered on, providing minimal visibility but adding to the chaotic atmosphere. Master Sergeant Kelly was working frantically to restore full power and re-establish communication with the Marines inside the facility, but the technical problems were proving more complex than initially anticipated. What happened next occurred so quickly that Sarah barely had time to process the sequence of events. The panicked role-player, a young Marine who had been assigned to play a civilian hostage, stumbled into the section where Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's team was operating. In the dim emergency lighting and confused atmosphere, the role-player's erratic movements and distressed calls created a situation that could have been tragically misinterpreted. Rodriguez and his men responded with admirable restraint, recognizing that the role-player was genuinely confused rather than following his assigned script. They attempted to calm him and guide him to safety, but the role-player's panic continued to escalate. He began moving more frantically, bumping into equipment and furniture in the darkened room, his distress calls becoming louder and more incoherent. The situation became critical when the role-player, in his panic, grabbed a training weapon that had been left unsecured due to the equipment malfunction. It was only a simulation weapon, designed to fire marking rounds rather than live ammunition, but, in the confusion and limited visibility, it represented a potential threat that the Marines had to address according to their training protocols. Sarah could see the tension ratcheting up as Rodriguez and his team found themselves in an impossible situation. They needed to secure the weapon from the panicked role-player without using excessive force, but the young Marine's panic was making rational communication increasingly difficult. The exercise had transformed from a controlled training scenario into a real-world crisis management situation. From her position in the observation area, Sarah could see aspects of the situation that the Marines inside the facility couldn't perceive. She noticed that the role-player's panic was being exacerbated by claustrophobia brought on by the power failure and emergency lighting. She recognized signs of a full-blown panic attack that was making the young Marine incapable of responding rationally to verbal commands. Master Sergeant Kelly was still working on the technical problems, but Sarah realized that the situation inside the facility needed immediate intervention. The Marines were handling the crisis professionally, but their training had prepared them to deal with hostile combatants or cooperative civilians, not with someone experiencing a genuine psychological emergency in a confined space. Without fully considering the implications of her decision, Sarah moved from the observation area toward the facility entrance. Master Sergeant Kelly looked up from his technical diagnostics as she approached. "Ma'am, you need to stay in the observation area until we get this situation resolved," he said firmly but politely. "That Marine is having a panic attack," Sarah replied, her voice carrying an authority that surprised both herself and the instructor. "He's not going to respond to standard de-escalation techniques while he's in that psychological state." Kelly hesitated, clearly torn between his responsibility to maintain safety protocols and his recognition that Sarah might have insights that could help resolve the crisis. "Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but this is a tactical situation that needs to be handled by trained personnel." Sarah understood his position, but she could see through the facility's windows that the situation was continuing to escalate. The role-player's panic was affecting the Marines as well, creating stress and tension that could lead to poor decisions if the crisis wasn't resolved quickly. Master Sergeant, Sarah said, her voice remaining calm but gaining intensity, I have training in crisis psychology and de-escalation techniques. I can help that Marine before this situation becomes something nobody wants to deal with. Kelly looked at her skeptically. The quiet cultural consultant who had spent the week delivering classroom presentations hardly seemed like someone equipped to handle a high-stress tactical situation. But something in Sarah's demeanor had changed, a confidence and authority that hadn't been apparent during her training sessions. Before Kelly could respond, the situation inside the facility took another turn for the worse. The panicked role-player had backed into a corner, still clutching the training weapon, while Rodriguez and his team tried to approach him safely. But their tactical movements, designed to secure threats and maintain unit safety, were having the opposite effect on someone in the grip of a panic attack. Sarah could see that the Marines' professional competence was actually contributing to the problem. Their coordinated movements and tactical positioning were triggering the role-player's flight response, making him feel trapped and threatened rather than safe and protected. He's going to do something desperate if this continues, Sarah told Kelly urgently. The Marines are doing everything right tactically, but they're doing everything wrong psychologically for someone in his condition. Kelly's radio crackled with Rodriguez's voice, Control, we need guidance on this situation. The role-player is not responding to verbal commands, and his behavior is becoming increasingly erratic. Sarah looked directly at Master Sergeant Kelly. Let me help before someone gets hurt. Kelly hesitated for another moment, weighing his options. The standard protocols didn't cover situations like this, and his responsibility was to ensure everyone's safety. After a moment that felt much longer than it actually was, he made his decision. Ma'am, if you go in there, you follow my instructions exactly. This is still a military facility, and safety protocols apply to everyone. Sarah nodded her understanding, but, as she prepared to enter the facility, she realized that she was about to cross a line she had maintained her entire life. For more than 2 decades, she had kept her capabilities hidden, allowing others to see only the quiet, non-threatening civilian consultant. But this situation demanded more than cultural expertise and classroom knowledge. As Sarah moved toward the facility entrance, she began mentally preparing for what might be required of her. The Marines inside had no idea that the soft-spoken cultural consultant was about to demonstrate skills they never suspected she possessed. They were about to discover that their assumptions about quiet, bookish civilians might need significant revision. The door to the facility opened, and Sarah stepped into the emergency-lit environment where 8 elite Marines were dealing with a crisis that their extensive training hadn't fully prepared them to handle. She was about to show them that sometimes the most unexpected people possess exactly the capabilities that challenging situations demand. #The Revelation. Sarah entered the dimly lit facility with movements that immediately caught the attention of the nearest Marines. Gone was the hesitant, careful posture they had observed all week. Instead, she moved with fluid precision, her footsteps silent on the concrete floor, her awareness extending to every corner of the space around her. Corporal Kim was the first to notice her presence. "Ma'am, you shouldn't be in here," he called out softly, concerned for her safety but trying not to add to the chaos by speaking loudly. Sarah acknowledged him with a slight nod but continued moving toward the section where Rodriguez and his team were dealing with the panicked role-player. As she approached, she could hear the young Marines' increasingly distressed breathing and see the tension in the surrounding Marines as they tried to balance their tactical training with their recognition that they were dealing with someone experiencing a genuine psychological crisis. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," Sarah said quietly as she approached his position. Her voice carried clearly through the space despite its soft tone, and Rodriguez turned toward her with surprise evident on his face. "Ma'am, you need to get back to the observation area," Rodriguez said firmly. "This situation is unstable, and we can't guarantee your safety." Sarah moved closer, and Rodriguez was struck by the transformation in her demeanor. The uncertain, apologetic civilian consultant had been replaced by someone who radiated calm confidence and situational awareness. Her eyes were scanning the environment continuously, processing information and calculating options in ways that reminded him of his most experienced operators. "Staff Sergeant, that Marine is experiencing a full panic attack triggered by claustrophobia and sensory overload," Sarah explained, her voice remaining calm but carrying unmistakable authority. Your tactical approach is perfect for dealing with a hostile combatant, but it's making his psychological state worse. Rodriguez found himself listening despite his initial instinct to get the civilian out of harm's way. Something about Sarah's manner suggested knowledge and capabilities that hadn't been apparent during their classroom sessions. "What do you suggest, ma'am?" he asked, recognizing that his current approach wasn't working and that the situation was continuing to deteriorate. Sarah studied the scene for a moment, observing the panicked role-player's positioning, breathing patterns, and behavioral indicators. Her assessment was swift and comprehensive, incorporating both her psychological training and tactical considerations that surprised Rodriguez with their sophistication. "He's backed into a corner because he feels trapped, and your coordinated movements are triggering his fight-or-flight response," Sarah explained. "I need you to have your team step back and create some space. Then, I'm going to approach him using de-escalation techniques specifically designed for panic attacks." Corporal Washington, who had moved closer to hear the conversation, looked skeptical. "Ma'am, with all due respect, if he panics further and does something with that weapon, you could get seriously hurt. You should let us handle this." Sarah turned to look at Washington directly, and he was surprised by what he saw in her eyes. The quiet uncertainty he had observed all week had been replaced by focused determination and unmistakable confidence. "Corporal Washington, I understand your concern," Sarah replied evenly. "But I have extensive training in crisis intervention, and I can handle this situation." There was something in her tone that made Washington hesitate. This wasn't the tentative cultural consultant who had been delivering classroom presentations. This was someone who spoke with the authority of experience and genuine capability. Rodriguez made a command decision. "Fall back 10 feet and maintain overwatch," he instructed his team. "Give the consultant room to work, but be ready to intervene if necessary." Sarah nodded her appreciation and began moving slowly toward the panicked role-player. Her approach was completely different from the Marines' tactical movements. Instead of the coordinated, purposeful advance of trained operators, she moved with fluid grace that somehow managed to be both non-threatening and completely controlled. "Hey there," Sarah called out softly to the role-player, her voice carrying a warmth and calm that immediately distinguished her from the tactical environment around them. "My name is Sarah, and I can see that you're having a really tough time right now." The young Marine looked toward her, his breathing still rapid and shallow, but her non-threatening approach and gentle tone began to register through his panic. "I know this feels really overwhelming," Sarah continued, moving closer with movements that were somehow both casual and precisely calculated. "The darkness, the confined space, all the people around you, it's a lot to handle all at once." Rodriguez watched with growing amazement as Sarah's approach began to have an immediate effect on the role-player. Her voice, her posture, her entire presence seemed designed to counteract the factors that were driving his panic attack. "I'm going to come a little closer, okay?" Sarah said, continuing her slow advance. "I'm not here to do anything except help you feel a little more comfortable." What happened next would be replayed in the minds of all 8 Marines for years afterward. The panicked role-player, still gripping the training weapon, suddenly made an explosive movement toward Sarah. His panic attack had reached the point where his rational thinking was completely overwhelmed, and her approach triggered an instinctive defensive reaction. The movement was fast and unpredictable, exactly the type of threat that could result in serious injury even with a training weapon. The surrounding Marines immediately began moving to intervene, their training taking over as they recognized a genuine threat to a civilian. But what they witnessed in the next 3 seconds challenged everything they thought they knew about Sarah Chen. The panicked Marines' lunge toward Sarah was met not with the frightened retreat they expected, but with a response that demonstrated combat skills they never could have imagined. Sarah's movement was so fluid and precise that it seemed almost choreographed, but the devastating effectiveness was unmistakably real. She deflected the role-player's weapon arm with a technique that perfectly redirected his momentum while simultaneously stepping inside his reach. Her response was controlled and measured, enough force to neutralize the threat immediately, but not enough to cause unnecessary harm to someone who was clearly not a malicious aggressor. The panicked Marine found himself on the ground, completely immobilized but uninjured, with the training weapon secured and his panic attack beginning to subside as Sarah's calm presence and controlled response helped restore his rational thinking. But Sarah wasn't finished. The Marines who had been moving to intervene found themselves facing something they had never encountered before. In the span of the next 27 seconds, Sarah demonstrated capabilities that redefined their understanding of what was possible. Corporal Kim reached her first, moving with the speed and aggression of an elite operator attempting to secure what he perceived as a chaotic situation. Sarah's response to his approach was a textbook demonstration of defensive tactics that neutralized his advance while simultaneously positioning her for the next threat. Sergeant Mitchell and Corporal Washington moved to flank her from opposite sides, their coordination reflecting years of training and operational experience. Sarah's counter was a flowing sequence of movements that seemed to anticipate their tactics before they fully committed to them. Private First Class Brooks attempted to use his size advantage to overwhelm her with a direct approach, while Lance Corporal Thompson tried to capitalize on what he thought was Sarah's focus on Brooks. Both Marines found themselves neutralized by techniques that were so precisely executed they seemed almost effortless. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, Sergeant Parker, and Corporal Foster coordinated their approach, using their combined experience to create what should have been an overwhelming tactical advantage. Instead, they discovered that Sarah's defensive capabilities extended far beyond anything their experience had prepared them to encounter. Each Marine was neutralized with techniques that demonstrated not just exceptional skill, but an understanding of their individual approaches and capabilities that suggested Sarah had been observing and analyzing their methods throughout the week. Her responses were perfectly calibrated, enough force to end each engagement definitively, but not enough to cause any actual injury. The entire sequence lasted exactly 30 seconds from the moment the first Marine began moving to intervene until the last one found himself immobilized on the training facility floor. 8 elite Marines, each representing years of the military's finest training and operational experience, had been systematically neutralized by the quiet cultural consultant they had spent the week categorizing as a fragile civilian. As the emergency lighting cast eerie shadows across the training facility, Sarah stood in the center of the room, breathing normally and completely controlled, while 8 of the Marine Corps' finest operators lay scattered around her, none injured but all completely immobilized by techniques that had been applied with surgical precision. The silence that followed was profound. Master Sergeant Kelly's voice crackled through the facility's communication system, but he seemed unable to find words for what the monitoring equipment had recorded. The role player who had triggered the entire sequence was sitting quietly against the wall, his panic attack subsided, looking around with confusion at the scene that had unfolded around him. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was the first to speak. "Ma'am," he said from his position on the floor, his voice carrying a mixture of respect, amazement, and complete bewilderment, "who the hell are you?" Sarah looked around at the Marines she had just neutralized, her expression returning to the calm, professional demeanor they had known all week. But now that demeanor carried an entirely different meaning. What they had interpreted as uncertain shyness was revealed to be the quiet confidence of someone who had never needed to prove anything to anyone. "I'm Sarah Chen," she replied simply, beginning to help Rodriguez to his feet. "I'm a cultural consultant with the Department of Defense, just like I told you on Monday." Corporal Washington accepted her assistance in standing up, his massive frame moving with obvious discomfort that had nothing to do with physical injury. "Ma'am, that's not what I mean, and you know it." "Where did you learn to do that?" Sarah helped each Marine to his feet before answering. Her movements remained fluid and controlled, but now the Marines recognized the unconscious grace they had observed all week as evidence of training and capability rather than simple femininity. "My father is Colonel James Chen, currently stationed at Fort Bragg," Sarah explained as she assisted Sergeant Mitchell. "He started teaching me martial arts when I was 5 years old. I'd been training consistently for 17 years. 17 years? Corporal Kim asked, working to restore feeling to his temporarily paralyzed arm. "What styles?" "Primarily Krav Maga, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and traditional karate," Sarah replied. "But I've also studied Aikido, Muay Thai, and some military combatives techniques that my father thought would be useful." Lance Corporal Thompson shook his head in amazement. "Ma'am, I've been training in martial arts for 8 years, and I've never seen anything like what you just did. That wasn't just knowing different styles, that was reading all of us individually and countering our specific approaches." Sarah's explanation was matter of fact, delivered in the same calm tone she had used throughout the week. Part of my training involved studying different fighting styles and tactical approaches so I could develop appropriate defensive responses. When I've been observing your training exercises this week, I was also analyzing your individual movement patterns and combat preferences. The implications of her statement began to sink in for the Marines. The quiet cultural consultant who they had assumed was out of place in their tactical environment had actually been conducting her own professional assessment of their capabilities and methods. "So while we were thinking you didn't belong here," Rodriguez said slowly, "you were actually studying us like we were training exercises?" Sarah's slight smile was the first genuinely relaxed expression the Marines had seen from her all week. "Not exactly like training exercises, Staff Sergeant. I was observing you as professional operators while also preparing for the possibility that I might need to defend myself if a training situation went wrong." Corporal Foster, who had been unusually quiet during the exchange, finally spoke up. "Ma'am, why didn't you tell us about your background? Why let us think you were just a civilian academic?" Sarah's expression became more serious as she considered her answer. "Because my job is to teach cultural awareness and communication strategies, not to impress people with martial arts skills. My father taught me that competent people don't need to advertise their capabilities." Master Sergeant Kelly's voice came through the communication system again, clearer this time. "All personnel maintain positions while we restore full power and complete safety checks." As the Marines waited for the facility systems to be restored, they found themselves looking at Sarah with completely different eyes. The transformation wasn't just in how they perceived her capabilities, but in how they understood her entire approach to their training week. "Ma'am," Washington said thoughtfully, "when you were teaching us about cultural assumptions and communication strategies, were you using us as examples?" Sarah's expression suggested that Washington had identified something significant. "In part, yes. One of the most important lessons about cultural awareness is recognizing how our assumptions about others affect our ability to understand their actual capabilities and intentions." Rodriguez laughed, but it was the sound of genuine respect rather than humor. "So you spent the week teaching us not to make assumptions about people from different cultures, while we were making assumptions about you based on our own cultural biases." "That's exactly right, Staff Sergeant. You assumed that because I'm quiet and work as a civilian consultant, I must be weak and unsuited for challenging situations. But those assumptions were based on your cultural conditioning, not on any actual evidence about my capabilities." The 8 Marines spent the remaining time until power was restored engaging in a completely different kind of conversation with Sarah. Instead of the polite but distant interaction that had characterized their previous sessions, they found themselves asking genuine questions about her background, her training, and her perspective on their assumptions about civilian capabilities. When Master Sergeant Kelly finally entered the facility to check on everyone's condition, he found 8 elite Marines and 1 cultural consultant engaged in the most productive discussion about cultural awareness and unconscious bias that any of them had ever experienced. "Everyone okay in here?" Kelly asked, noting the relaxed atmosphere that had replaced the crisis situation he had been monitoring. "Better than okay, Master Sergeant," Rodriguez replied. "I think we just learned more about cultural assumptions in the last hour than we learned in the previous 4 days." As Sarah gathered her materials and prepared to leave Camp Pendleton, she reflected on the unexpected turn her assignment had taken. She had come to teach Marines about cultural awareness, but the real lesson had been about the dangers of making assumptions about people based on limited information and cultural stereotypes. The 8 Marines who had spent the week categorizing her as a fragile civilian consultant were now dealing with a completely revised understanding of what quiet competence could look like. They had learned that strength didn't always announce itself, that capability didn't always seek recognition, and that the most dangerous opponents were often the ones nobody suspected. For Sarah, the experience had been a reminder that sometimes circumstances demand that even the most private people reveal their true capabilities. She had spent her life avoiding confrontation and allowing others to underestimate her, but when the situation required it, she had been prepared to demonstrate exactly what 2 decades of disciplined training could produce. As she walked through the gates of Camp Pendleton for the final time, Sarah carried with her the knowledge that 8 elite Marines would never again make assumptions about quiet women who preferred books to parties. They had learned that the most profound strength often wore the most unassuming faces, and that true competence rarely felt the need to advertise itself. The cultural consultant who had spent her life being overlooked had finally found a situation where being underestimated had become the ultimate strategic advantage. Sometimes the greatest power lies not in proving what you can do, but in choosing carefully when to reveal who you really are.